What's good? It's Wood. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Shakur Stevenson, 18 wins and 0 losses, defending his WBC and WBO super featherweight titles against Robson Conceicao, 17 wins and 1 loss. This is the return to the ring for Shakur Stevenson, one of boxing's greatest young talents in the game. And, you know, with boxing, we have this idea where if somebody's undefeated and they are looking somewhat spotless in the ring, we tend to exalt and elevate their stature. And if somebody runs into sometimes just one loss, depending on the type of loss, that just totally shatters the perception of the previously esteemed, we'll call it the new shiny object. I feel like boxing is continuously kind of a revolving door, a conveyor belt of the shiny new objects. And right now in today's game, I don't know if any fighter, especially a young fighter, that's as shiny as Shakur Stevenson. You would have to look to maybe Jerome Boots Ennis. You know, you've got David Benavidez, you've got Devin Haney, you've got Virgil Ortiz, you've got some very, very good young fighters, but Shakur Stevenson, if he's handing in his assignments and it's the end of the semester and he's basically getting straight A's all the way up and down, even though he doesn't have sensational knockout power. He's been that good from a sweet science standpoint. You know, you even get his peers. You know how they were talking about the 4 kings and then people kind of laughed at that idea because they weren't fighting each other. I'm talking about the newer 4 kings that was then relegated to maybe 4 princes in the lightweight division, or at least they were all 4 lightweights about a year or 2 ago. We're talking, Teofimo Lopez, Gervonta Tank Davis, Ryan Garcia, Devin Haney. Well, there was a 5th guy who was technically 1 to 2 weight classes below, and that was Shakur Stevenson. And he was basically always pointed to as, hey, but don't forget about him. He might be as good or better than all of these other 4 guys that we're mentioning. And when you hear other boxers talk about Shakur Stevenson, he's held in a similar regard to when you hear other people, other boxers, talking about Terrence Crawford, where you could tell it's pretty much across the board respect for the guy's skills. And so this is going to be Shakur Stevenson's return to the ring since unifying 2 of the belts after beating Oscar Valdez in Stevenson's biggest and best win to date. The previously undefeated 2-division champion, Oscar Valdez, who, at 126, Oscar Valdez was a belt holder, then went up to 130, and it was the WBO belt that Valdez held, and Shakur Stevenson basically was 1 year behind him, trying to call him out, but after Valdez went to 130, Shakur Stevenson ended up fighting Joet Gonzalez for the then vacant, after Valdez vacated that WBO featherweight belt. It was Stevenson fighting Joet Gonzalez for that vacant belt. So he occupied the same belt that Valdez occupied, and then several fights later, up at 130, finally has a showdown against Oscar Valdez, where Stevenson's coming in with the WBO belt and Valdez is coming in with the WBC belt that he won in an upset knockout win over Miguel Berchelt. And so that's how Shakur Stevenson unified 2 of the belts up at 130. And so Valdez was seen to be the other best fighter in the division. Yeah, you have Joe Cordina, who recently knocked out Ogawa unexpectedly. And then you've got Hector Garcia, who first upset Chris Colbert on short notice and then beat Roger Gutierrez for another share of the 130-pound title. So you have other belt holders there, and I'm sure a lot of people would like to see Shakur Stevenson versus Hector Garcia, even though Stevenson would be a heavy favorite. But Stevenson is already seen to have beaten the other best guy, at least perceptions-wise, in the 130-pound division. His opponent right here, Robson Conceicao, former gold medalist, Olympic gold medalist, didn't turn pro until much later on. I think he was a part of the Navy, the Brazilian Navy, after his first attempt at an Olympic medal, because he actually participated in 3 different Olympics. It wasn't until the 2016 games in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Robson Conceicao is a Brazilian fighter, where he won a gold medal and then turned pro. So he turned pro much later later than most professionals. And he has only one loss in his career, and it was to Oscar Valdez. And in that fight, you know, it was kind of like a famously controversial fight because this is for Oscar Valdez, this is just after beating Miguel Berchelt, where Oscar Valdez was basically seen as in high esteem because of that upset, devastating knockout win. A lot of people had it as their knockout of the year. It was one of the upsets of the year. But then leading into that Oscar Valdez fight against Robson Conceicao, Oscar Valdez tested positive multiple times for PEDs. And so instead of that fight being scrapped or canceled or Oscar Valdez being stripped of his title, they let the fight go on and they let Oscar Valdez keep his title. That was a very controversial moment in recent boxing history. Well, when they took to the ring, this was in Tucson, Arizona, which was a very pro-Oscar Valdez crowd, a lot of Latinos, Mexicans in particular in Arizona. And this was a pretty scary fight for Oscar Valdez. Like, Robson Conceicao was looking like much more of the sweet scientist who was working behind a jab, letting the shorter Oscar Valdez jump in, and then Robson Conceicao would counter him effectively. Easily won the first couple of rounds. It looked like he probably should have taken like 4 out of the first 5 rounds or something like that. Well, Oscar Valdez ends up battling back and winning via unanimous decision. And in that fight, I feel like Robson Conceicao showed a lot of the skills that he has, but he left a lot on the table where, no, I don't agree with the broadcast that day where Andre Ward was basically insinuating that Valdez was winning most of those later rounds. Timothy Bradley was a little bit more like on the fence about it. But I do think that Robson Conceicao did leave a lot on the table by not throwing more punches during the second half of the fight. It's almost like he had figured that he had banked enough of the rounds in the first half of the fight to where he could do more posturing, where he was kind of doing the, you know, where Roy Jones would kind of walk, you know, laterally while keeping his opponent like out the corner of his eye and barely facing him, and then, you know, ducking if they throw a punch or doing something to throw like one pot shot punch at a time. There was just a lot more of that going on in the second half of the fight. Yes, some of that was happening in the first half of the fight as well, but Conceicao was landing many more effective and meaningful shots in the first half of the fight. So I do think it was a very controversial decision. I think that fight could have really gone either way. You know, as I was watching the fight, I was, you know, thinking halfway through the fight, like, damn, Robson Conceicao might pull this off. And then I saw Oscar Valdez coming back, and I saw Conceicao's volume decreased pretty dramatically, like where it got a little bit frustrating if you wanted to see him stay competitive in those late rounds. Not to say he wasn't competitive, but you just got the feeling that he needed to be throwing more punches and kind of staying engaged in the same way that he was in the first half of the fight. Now, granted, Oscar Valdez is a very dangerous pressure fighter who's got one hell of a left hook and is very, very persistent and resilient. But yeah, Conceicao ended up letting this one, I mean, not letting this, but he let a lot of the rounds, I feel, slip away to where Oscar Valdez won a unanimous but controversial and pretty much disputed decision. And that was Valdez's last fight before fighting that title unification fight against Shakur Stevenson. Now, as scary as that fight was for Oscar Valdez and as competitive as it was, and, you know, the fact that that was Conceicao's only loss to date, it was actually a fight for Conceicao a couple fights prior that ended up being his most remarkable achievement, I would say. And this was a fight against Luis Correa. And this was in that 2020 late, I think it was the fall of 2020, just after that COVID summer where they shut boxing down. Then they started bringing a lot of the fights back where Eddie Hearn had his thing going on where, you know, Dillian White fought Povetkin for the first time. And, you know, Bob Arum, Top Rank had, you know, Shakur Stevenson fighting guys like Felix Caraballo at the time to like no crowd. Well, during that era, or at least the fall of that year, Conceicao fights Luis Correa. And I think like Michaela Mayer fought on that card too. And the headliner, I believe, was Nadia Inoue versus Andrew Maloney. And Correa dropped Conceicao where he hit him with like a long looping, a sweeping hook, caught him upside the head. And Conceicao, you know, he staggered backwards and then his legs stiffened and he fell straight on his back, where it was one of those leg stiffening knockdowns where it's pretty remarkable that he even recovered from that. Again, this was the second round of a 10-round fight. In the fourth round, Conceicao had a point deducted for low blows, and it was like borderline low, but he had a point taken away. And then in the sixth round, he had another point taken away for low blows. So he suffers a knockdown. That's a 10-8 round for Korea, and then has 2 different points taken away in different rounds. So, if Conceicao wins the round, then it ends up being 9-9. And then if Korea wins that round where Conceicao gets a point taken away, then it becomes another 10-8 round. And this is only a 10-rounder, so you don't have as much time to get back into the scorecards. Well, Conceicao, who's known to be more of a sweet scientist, kind of a slicker fighter, as they say, he actually just had to put his head down and throw punches for the entire fight to battle back in this one. Again, knockdown and 2 different points deducted. Conceicao manages to still win a unanimous, not a split decision, majority decision, a unanimous decision over Luis Correa. That, to me, was the biggest achievement for Robson Conceicao, even as competitive as he was with Oscar Valdez. It just showed you the type of heart that he has, how much spirit and desire and just a lot of grit to be able to just, because that if you stay too economical in your punch output, you're not going to get a lot of these rounds against a guy who's continuously coming forward and letting his hands go. Conceicao, in this case, actually outworked Luis Correa, out-volumed him, just threw more punches, put his head down, and he had to grind to win that unanimous decision win. Hats off to Conceicao for that W. So when I look at Shakur Stevenson versus Robson Conceicao, or should I say Robson Conceicao, because, in Brazilian, the Portuguese language, you'll see a lot of people who have like an R in the beginning of their name, but it's pronounced with a H, like Royce Gracie. MMA fans know all about that. But when I'm analyzing Shakur Stevenson versus Robson Conceicao, I don't think that this is a style that will be conducive to making Shakur Stevenson look special, especially in front of his home crowd in New Jersey. So this is going to be a hometown fight for Shakur Stevenson. And a lot of people look at that as being an advantage. And from a crowd standpoint, yeah, it can be. When you have like a British crowd just reacting to everything that their fighter's doing, or, just one of those dynamics where it could influence the judges. It could also have an impact on the fighter because of the fight week leading up, just the amount of distractions that are taking place in the weeks and days leading up to the fight. And then also the added pressure to look good and to look dominant, special in front of your home crowd. I think that there's going to be more of the latter in the case of Shakur Stevenson, where I think that this is actually going to be a little bit to his detriment. And even, home crowd aside, stylistically, Robson Conceicao is just one of those guys who, he's not as quick as Stevenson, but he's a good enough, a sharp enough fighter to where he's arguably the best pure boxer that Shakur Stevenson has had to fight yet in the professional ranks. I mean, the other guys that you could possibly put up there would be who? Like Christopher Diaz, Joet Gonzalez perhaps, Jamel Herring, maybe. And then, Stevenson also beat Jeremiah Nakatila, which is, I think, a win that's going to age very well because of how hard Nakatila has been hitting. Like, we just saw him stop Miguel Berchelt. And granted, Miguel Berchelt is either at or near retirement phase of his career. But I really wonder how Nakatila's career is going to play out in the next few fights. And yeah, I think that's a win that's going to age pretty well for Shakur Stevenson. It didn't mean a ton at the time, even though if you looked at, Nakatila's, background and record, you say, hey, this guy hits with some pop, and he loves throwing that devastating right hand, and he'll throw it again and again and again. And Shakur Stevenson actually had to pretty much bide his time and respect the guy's power in that fight. Actually got buzzed a couple of times. That was maybe the hardest I've seen Shakur Stevenson hit as a pro thus far. But, it was after that Nakatila fight where Shakur Stevenson just looked dominant against Jamel Herring. And I'm kind of having, Jamel Herring vibes in looking at this Robson Conceicao matchup. Not that Herring and Conceicao have identical styles or anything like that. But, they're both taller than Shakur Stevenson. They both have a reach advantage over Shakur Stevenson. But it wasn't until you saw Stevenson in the ring with, then title holder. That's how Stevenson earned the first share of his 130-pound belt. It was the WBO belt that Jamel Herring had. And Jamel Herring was coming off of that knockout win over Carl Frampton that sent Carl Frampton into retirement. But it wasn't until I saw Stevenson and Herring in the ring that it became evident, man, Stevenson is so much quicker than Jamel Herring, to where Jamel Herring looks like he's surrounded by Shakur Stevenson. And, you know, he was breaking him off with like 5-6 punch combinations. And we're talking about the early rounds. It's not like Shakur Stevenson was patient in those early rounds against Herring and then started to cook down the line. No. He established supremacy in the first couple of rounds against Herring, where it looked like Shakur Stevenson might actually get an early knockout or stoppage over Herring. Yes, Herring did battle back in the middle rounds, but never really truly made it a competitive fight. That was an excellent performance for Shakur Stevenson. He just looked levels and levels and levels better than Jamel Herring there. And that was one of those eye-opening, wow, coming out moments for Shakur Stevenson. In fact, that might have been a bigger coming out moment for Shakur Stevenson than even his following win against Oscar Valdez, even though he won the vast majority of the rounds against the then undefeated two-division champion, Oscar Valdez. I think that Shakur Stevenson's performance against Jamel Herring was a lot more, oh my goodness, this guy is good. You know, one of those things, like when you saw Floyd Mayweather just beating the brakes off of the late, great Arturo Gatti. But, you know, like Jamel Herring, who does have some sweet science in him. He's a good boxer, not a great boxer. I think Conceicao might be even a little bit better as a technical boxer, even though, again, I've seen Conceicao have to, you know, devolve into just putting his head down and just kind of slugging it out with combinations in a couple of his fights, especially that Luis Correa one. And by the way, since that loss to Oscar Valdez, Conceicao does have one more win against Javier or Xavier Martinez in January of this year, 2022, and he won that one via unanimous decision. But I think that when we see these two fighters in the ring, a lot of questions are going to be answered in the first couple of rounds. We're going to see how much quicker Shakur Stevenson is than Robson Conceicao. We'll see if that sweet science technical style that sometimes works well for Conceicao is going to have any success against Shakur Stevenson. Now, I tend to think that it's going to be Conceicao who's got to get adjusted to, you know, the southpaw nature of Shakur Stevenson's game, where Shakur Stevenson is a master range controller. He's one of those guys who seems like he's pretty much dictating all of the terms of the exchanges, when they happen, how they happen, at what angles they occur. Shakur Stevenson, again, he just checks all of those boxes in terms of all of the things that you need to do to be an elite technical boxer, skill-wise. But, you know, Stevenson's win against Valdez, as dominant as he was, it's hard to look at that fight and then to deduce or to predict what you might get out of Stevenson Conceicao, because Valdez is a much shorter fighter who's got shorter arms, completely different style. He's looking to close the distance, get in with the jab, and find opportunities to launch that straight right and especially that devastating left hook. Oscar Valdez is trying to close the distance. Conceicao is more somebody who's trying to, you know, shoot uppercuts from boxing range, you know, shoot his right hand, shoot his left hook. Very nice left hook. In fact, you know, I was kind of getting, I would say, Roy Jones light vibes in the early rounds between Valdez and Conceicao, where Conceicao, not only with that posturing, but with, you know, kind of putting his, you know, lead left hand down for some moments and trying to whip a hook from having it low and then whipping it up high. Like, Conceicao will do that, but he'll also jab to the body, look low, and shoot the hook high. I don't think a lot of these things are going to work against Shakur Stevenson if he's on his A game. But I kind of think Shakur Stevenson will come in, I'll say, at his A- game. I think it's going to be enough to win still against Conceicao. But I think Conceicao is going to neutralize maybe some of the things that really make Shakur Stevenson tick. I mean, he does pump the jab out there. He's got good durability and endurance. So I think that he's going to at least be competitive through some of the first half of the fight, where you might even have a couple of swing rounds or rounds that Conceicao might win. Now, Shakur Stevenson is one of the best round winners in the game. You have certain fighters who put people's lights out. You have certain, you know, fighters who are a little bit more, you know, feast or famine with their knockout power. Think Deontay Wilder, where he's either knocking the guy out or he might be losing the round. And then you've got guys who, you know, are pressure fighters and will give up some of the early rounds to make big statements later on in the fight. Even Canelo will lose a couple early rounds in some of his fights and then will just have a downpour of devastating activity in the middle rounds. But then you've got guys that seem to win just about every round of every fight. Like Mayweather was like that through much of his career. I know there was the Jose Luis Castillo fight, the DeMarcus Corley fight, Emmanuel Augustus early in his career. I get that. But in terms of being a great round winner, you know, you've got Shakur Stevenson, you've got Devin Haney also in today's game. Shakur Stevenson is one of the best round winners in the sport. I think that this will be one of the rare occasions where Conceicao might win multiple rounds in the first 6 rounds of the fight. But I think Shakur Stevenson is going to start to take over a bit, where Conceicao will still be somewhat in the fight, but I think that he's going to start wearing more of the damage, where he's going to start getting beaten up more and more as the fight continues. Now, we have seen Shakur Stevenson fights where he seems to be in control from the first round on, but still isn't able to like really hit the gas and get the guy out of there, or to, you know, just put on an ultra beating, we'll say. You know, like his fight against Christopher Diaz, or his fight against Joet Gonzalez, Toka Khan Clary, Nakathila. These are fights that Shakur Stevenson won very handily via decision, but once he took control of the fight, it seemed like he was more or less content with dominating round after round after round without doing too much damage or just, you know, devastating the opponent. I think this fight might look a little bit more like that. I think Robson Conceicao goes the distance against Shakur Stevenson. He might suffer a knockdown, but he's got enough experience, wherewithal, durability, you know, boxing IQ, if you will, to, you know, avoid taking too many hard punches in any given stretch, and is enough of a survivor where he'll know when to clinch, he'll know, you know, when to throw the jab, when to change levels, when to do little things that will keep Shakur Stevenson from totally obliterating him. Now, I don't think that the same things that worked for Conceicao when he had to put his head down and grind out throwing all those punches against Luis Correa, I don't think that's going to work against Shakur Stevenson, because unlike Correa, Shakur Stevenson is rarely just there to get hit. He's always, you know, defensively responsible, and he's always at an angle where his head is off the center line, and where he's moving after throwing the jab and always fighting at different angles. He's, you know, just one of those trickier guys to hit. So I don't think Conceicao is going to be doing a ton of slugging it out with Shakur Stevenson. I do think Shakur Stevenson is going to start trying to sit on more of his punches to generate more power. But again, at the end of the day, I think this one goes the distance, and I've got Shakur Stevenson winning via unanimous decision. Now, if he does get by Conceicao and retain his WBC and WBO 130-pound titles, the question is, do they make a cross-promotional fight with Matchroom? You know, Eddie Hearn doing business with Bob Arum. Bob Arum, you know, obviously promotes Shakur Stevenson. Would they do Shakur Stevenson against, you know, one of the other belt holders, Joe Cordina? Do they do something with the PBC, where it's Bob Arum and PBC doing a fight between Shakur Stevenson and Hector Garcia? I see that as being kind of a long shot. PBC has arguably been the most egregious in not doing the cross-promotional fights. And I'm going to probably do a video at some point about this, but they do tend to concede a little bit if their fighter is a clear B-side guy. Like when they let Sean Porter go over to ESPN to fight against Terrence Crawford, I get the feeling that maybe if they really push for a Shakur Stevenson versus Hector Garcia fight, that PBC might give Garcia their blessing and let him fight Shakur Stevenson. But then again, I'm thinking, you know, maybe not, because there's no strong possibility that in the near future, Shakur Stevenson is going to come over to PBC. There was the idea that Terrence Crawford could come over to PBC after a fight against Sean Porter. So if you're PBC, that might have been a calculated or a more calculated investment. I don't see, maybe PBC doesn't want to send their belt holder, Hector Garcia, over to get beaten. You know, that's what people would likely think is going to be the case, to get beaten by Shakur Stevenson, to where now the PBC doesn't even have a belt in the 130-pound division. So maybe both the fight against Cordina and against Garcia are a long shot in terms of getting a cross-promotional effort. But if that's not the case, then it looks like they might do I guess they wouldn't do the Lomachenko fight either. Lomachenko's about to fight Jermaine Ortiz a little bit later on this year, right? That's going to be Lomachenko's return to the ring. And then he's likely going to fight the winner between, you know, Devin Haney and George Kambosos in that rematch. So Lomachenko is probably going to be occupied, assuming he gets by Jermaine Ortiz, of course. He's going to be occupied for maybe the next nearly the next calendar year. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do with Shakur Stevenson if he does beat Robson Conceicao. But yeah, let me know what you think about Stevenson versus Conceicao. Who do you expect to win and how? And if Shakur Stevenson, I'm just going to phrase it this way, if Stevenson wins, what do you think they do with him next? Please let me know what you think in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the Fight Talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.